Yeah. And I'm so glad that the link worked tonight. So thanks to Pam and Kelly working hard on this, trying to track down the mystery, not coming up with an answer, but came up with a solution. And that's what's most important, I think, for all of us. So this evening is session 6. This is our next to last session. The next one will be May 30th, when we will wrap up with expression of understanding, written expression, actually. All right. So here goes. All right. So just a quick reminder, we try to make this as participatory as possible. So here's all our icons that serve as reminders that come directly from the text. And hopefully we'll be able to use almost all of these this evening as we move forward. So I want to do a quick revisit with all of us on the topic of knowledge. And so I think when we sent out the structured guide, we asked that you think again about the curriculum review tool and think about it in terms of knowledge. And one of the things that Julia and I felt, we were so grateful for your patience with, all the rescheduling and so on, but we didn't feel like we had adequate time to really think about this and talk about it. So we've built in an opportunity here, right? So in a few moments, you'll be going into breakout rooms and we'll be watching how many people are actually with us. And then Kirsten will be putting you in breakout rooms, approximately 5, 6 individuals in a breakout room, dependent upon how many we have with us. All right. So I know that we asked you to think about it, but rather than just jump right into it, I thought maybe a little bit of a review would be helpful. All right. And so thinking a bit about text structures and bringing forward, when we talked about knowledge, one of the things we tried to do was clarify terminology, clarify meaning of the terms that we use. So we tend to use knowledge synonymously with lots of different types of knowledge that are necessary in order to make meaning of text. And so a few sessions ago, we talked about, well, actually, I think it's Alexander that came up with 27 different types of knowledge that we could be talking about in terms of literacy, but we thought that might be a few too many. So we actually talked about 7, right? So before we go to text structure knowledge, just thinking a little bit about the fact that when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about kind of the big bucket. We're talking about all that we carry with us in our long-term memory, all the experiences, all the things that we've learned, our beliefs, traditions, values, and so on. This is all that we're thinking about when we think about that, holistic term, knowledge. But then we can talk about some of the types of knowledge that are really very, very relevant to text comprehension, the making of meaning. And those include things like cultural knowledge, linguistic knowledge, and certainly we've talked a great deal about language systems and linguistic knowledge and the components of instruction that directly reflect the fact that we have to have a knowledge of semantics, syntax, phonology, even oral discourse, right? Which leads us then to text structures, text knowledge, strategic knowledge, the strategies that we bring to bear, they're very goal focused, conditional knowledge, when and where do we use those strategies, and so on. But of course, in the blueprint, what we've chosen to do is to focus in this particular section of the blueprint on 2 types of knowledge, one being text structure and the other one being background knowledge, right? So when we think about text structure, all right, we've provided you with some general guidelines, and Julia had some wonderful examples that she shared with you. But the general guidelines include the use of exemplar text. So be thinking a little bit now before we go to that curriculum review tool about, can you surface for yourself examples of the ways in which you are using exemplar text, or do you need to? The use of visual representations. And of course, when we think about visual representations, we think about graphic organizers. One of my pet peeves, I will tell you, with graphic organizers for text structure is that more often than not, I think in the past, not recently, but more often than not in the past, I saw generic visual representations, graphic organizers being used for text, whereas texts are different, even within the types of narrative and informational or expository. There are varied subtypes or nuances in text that we need to be thinking about. And then thinking about, strategies that directly connect to the structure of text, even thinking about the features of text, all right? Features, for instance, with informational or expository texts. Think about a science or a social studies text and the way it might be organized in terms of chapter headings and visuals and so on, right? So having strategies for understanding what's the purpose of those different features. And of course, attention to signal devices, both for narrative and informational text. Part of what we talk about oftentimes are these signal devices that help to connect up meaning within sentences. You see, we integrate throughout, but we also talk about these for writing. And so being cognizant that they carry meaning, and then effective questioning. Really, this is the number one strategy, I think. Even when we go back to the National Reading Panel and we begin to look at the different types of strategies that work in terms of comprehension, questioning, I think emerges, if not number one, close to it. So as you think a little bit about what you're going to talk about in your breakout room, and you think about text structure, kind of use this as a guideline to have conversation about what's in your curricula, or what do you plan for, what are the strengths of what you're doing, where are some of the challenges, maybe there's some action steps you can come up with. All right. And then, of course, the second part of knowledge for us that we discussed in the last seminar, last session, was background knowledge. So when we think about background knowledge now, we're thinking again about a subtype of knowledge. We're thinking about what is specific to the text at hand, the concepts, experiences that we carry that have to do with what's presented in the text at hand, so that we can directly make those connections, right? So not thinking so much about, this global idea, but, under that global idea, under that holistic idea, kind of pulling out and saying, what do I know about this particular text that will allow for me to go deeper with the text, right? And of course, what we presented them with the ABCs of background knowledge. And one of the things that I think Julia and I appreciated was when we asked you, what else do you do? Some of you came forward with, I think, some incredible suggestions, including things like podcasts and YouTube and so on. Yeah. So we'll probably be updating and revising, and you should do the same. Keep adding to your charts. All right. So under activating and assessing background knowledge, one of the things I always want you thinking about is it isn't just about seeing what it is your students know. You want to know what they know so that you know what you can do or need to do. So it becomes a form of assessment. All right. And so we have the examples that we have here. And then the building of background knowledge, again, through varied means. And then, of course, connecting and integrating so that students can do what? So that they can go deep, so they can go below the surface of the text. All right. So what else do I want to say about background knowledge? I think maybe that's it for now. All right. Let me move on. All right. And here's the curriculum review tool. All right. So within the tool itself, all right, we've asked you some questions, background knowledge and text structure. Here are the questions to consider. All right, the first question has to do with text structure, right? The second question has to do with background knowledge. So thinking about evidence and examples, thinking about strengths, maybe areas for development or improvement, and next steps. So we want you to have a conversation about this in terms of what you currently do. And if you think there are other things we should be adding, because this is very much this curriculum review tool, is the result of people asking us for something that helps them think about their curricula and program. And it's very much a draft, all right? So we're very open to suggestions. Now I see we have about 27 people on, so maybe if we do 5, 6 people, you'd have maybe, yeah. What do you think, Julia? Good? Yeah, all right. So Kirsten, if you want to assign them that way, and here's what we'll do before you all get assigned, all right? Text structures, all right, which is the first question there, the even numbered rooms should talk about those. So we're not going to make you talk about both things, all right? So even numbered rooms. So if there's, I'm guessing maybe 6 rooms, 2, 4, 6, or 2, 4, right? Odd number rooms talk about the background knowledge piece. So 1, 3, 5, right?
Nancy might need to take a picture of the slide though to have the question because they won't.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could do that real quick.
Yep.
That'd be awesome.
Absolutely. That would work. Okay. All right.
How
Okay.
many minutes?
Well, since we're putting 5 to 6 people in the room, I'd say let's do maybe, what do you think, Julia? 7, 8 minutes?
Yeah, I was gonna say 7. That's
Okay.
7 minutes. And when we come back, remember, we ask you to share. So have somebody who's the spokesperson and equal airtime for everybody. Okay. All right.
There you go.
I'll stop the share for a little bit. Hi. Oh, I am so thrilled that so many of you are here with us this evening again. Yeah. And that the link worked. So this is such good news. All right. All right. So
looks like one group just coming back, and
yeah, I can see we're almost all here. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Sarah has a question where I can find, let's see, what is she asking? Can you take a look at that? Yeah.
absolutely, Sarah. Thank you for that. So I think the recording for the last session can be found on the Padlet. Wait, oh, I just clicked the wrong thing. Here we go. I'm back. I'll go ahead and drop the link to the Padlet in the chat.
That would be great. Okay. Well, all right. Thanks everybody for taking the time to have that conversation. All right. Let's see if we can't go to the varied rooms. And I think what we'll do is we'll do even rooms. So we can start with text structure. All right. So hopefully you remember your room now and someone's going to speak for you, or maybe, someone will volunteer. Let's go to room number 2. Who was in room number 2 and wants to speak to the conversation that you just had in terms of, strengths and areas of need and possible action steps? What kind of a conversation did you have about text structure?
Hi, I will speak for room number 2.
Hello.
Hi. So we talked about a lot of things. We started by talking about the use of graphic organizers to really provide that concrete visual for students and understanding the various text structures. We also talked a lot about starting at the sentence level, right? Before students are able to read an entire article or passage and identify text structure, starting at that sentence level, and the use of sentence frames, so and so are different because, and really focusing on getting students to internalize signal words so that they can then recognize them in larger passages. And then we also talked about Nancy's favorite, the connection to writing. So I was talking about something that I do with my 5th graders when we do current events. The students are reading articles, they're practicing summary writing, but they are incorporating text structure in that way. So they're then looking to transfer that understanding into a summary, for example. So it kind of combines really all of those things. And I also shared with my group, the Florida Center for Reading Research has great activities and resources that for text structure that you can easily adapt to be contextualized within your curriculum.
Okay, wonderful, Aviva. Thanks so much for sharing. All right, how about we go to room 4? Who was in room 4? Calling room 4. No, no one was in room 4. Kirsten, can't hear you.
I have a list if that helps.
Yeah, that would help.
So that would be the group that had Caroline, Jane, Joyce, Keith, I think came a little bit later, Lisa, Lori Edgar.
Okay, so any one of you willing to step forward and just share a little bit what you talked about?
I can share just real quick. I forgot what number I was, so sorry.
Easy to do that. Easy to do that. Yeah.
We just basically shared what we're doing currently in the classroom and what we feel has been effective, or I think what we're experiencing a lot of is like a reading specialist, reading teacher, and then pushing in the classroom where students just struggle just understanding text features, understanding the purpose behind it, and trying to remember how to apply it. And it just takes time and patience, consistency.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and you may spend a lot of time on it, and then you go back to it, and it's like you didn't go over it at all. So just trying to realize it's constantly building, it's constantly working.
Yeah.
And then we have students that that may never had the opportunity to have that. So you're kind of like starting ground zero, and you're just kind of like baby stepping it. And then a lot of us share the frustrations our students may have because of you trying to use it and just trying to find, I don't say find other ways, but just kind of, and again, just being very basic and then just build. I think I just said that, but
yeah,
that was a theme among our group.
Yeah. So being cumulative in nature, I think is what you're saying. And it's surprising that you have students come to you that don't have that knowledge because it's so critical. I think we've underrated text structure. It's really about purpose. It's about how we hold those ideas together. I love that Aviva talked about starting at the sentence level, and then text structure really provides this hierarchy. All right. It provides a way of organizing up. It's really the macro structure of the text. It's moving, beyond just the individual idea units or even connections within paragraphs, but the overall organization of those idea units. So it's really, really important. Okay. 5, you're off the hook for now. Let's go, or rather, we did 2, 4, 6, right? Was there a 6? No. So 6. There isn't a 6, all right, but let's go to 1, all right? So now we're moving over from text structure to background knowledge. So room number 1. Yeah, that was odd number. Who's in
We had said some of us don't really have a core program or work one-on-one with students, but with the exposure we have had with certain programs, basically, when a text is introduced, there's a couple lines of like an introduction providing some basic background. It's very minimal. And a lot of it is really falling on the teacher to deliver that. So that is definitely lacking in a lot of the programs.
Yeah, that's really, it's surprising in some ways and not in others. I think, again, here's something that's been underrated. And I think it's difficult sometimes to make good decisions about just how much do you need to provide, immediately for students, maybe during reading and even after reading sometimes. So, yeah, it's not easy to navigate this. And yet, we're talking tonight about imprints. You can't make imprints without background knowledge. All right. And let's do room number 3 and 5. You are off the hook for now. Right. So room number 3.
Hi, I was in room number 3. We also, none of us were classroom teachers. We had a reading specialist, speech and language therapist, tutors, substitutes. We talked about our experiences with the curriculums that are being delivered around us. And we talked about like my current district. My district is currently in curriculum review. So it's been interesting because moving from a balanced literacy or possibly to a balanced literacy, but looking at some programs that are more structured literacy, we're seeing the difference. And the big push is the knowledge, which is very exciting to me as a reading specialist. In our whole group, we talked about the importance of it. But just yesterday, one of the programs had a slide that said, what's the difference between activating background knowledge and building background knowledge? And that was a wow. I'm so glad that they, said it that way. And we had discussed in our group, and then even yesterday, just how a lot of times it's like, oh, well, what do you know about this subject? And that's not enough to help build the kids' background knowledge. You might get off task. You hear like, oh, and that happened to my aunt, and you're really getting stories instead of building. And just something you had mentioned about building throughout. It doesn't have to be just in the beginning. So we talked about the importance of it and what a difference it can make. Just even those simulations with students, the cricket simulation, playing cricket recently. We talked about just a paragraph that kids can read versus that. And that was mind-blowing to them, why it's important to build. So that conversation happened about in our group that we need to let the kids know why background knowledge is important and how they can build it on their own. Look at the clue box. What do you know? What's going to help you? Yeah. And then the speech teacher that was in our group, she had shared that when she gives an assessment. Even children that can't decode, when they have the background knowledge, have the ability to know what they're talking about. So it's such an exciting time to move forward with the knowledge that background knowledge actually brings. I feel like a lot of programs are shifting to the way they really need to. So that was a big part of our conversation.
That's great. That's good news. You just conveyed some very good news that people are beginning to make that shift and recognize how important it is that if our students are going to come to text and make meaning of text, this is a core component for them. Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. I love it. All right. So we're going to go back to sharing the screen, and room 5, we will come back to you, not to worry. There will be another breakout room at the end. All right. And let me get the share back up, and let's see where we're going next. All right. All right. So we've done this. This was in the structured guide. This was the first thing we asked you to do. The second thing we asked you to do was to work your way through the chapter, do the check-ins, the try this, the check out, as well as the try this, and come prepared to share an activity that connects to what we've been talking about, or what we will be talking about this evening. All right. So implementing the blueprint, levels of understanding. All right. And of course, each and every time, at the very beginning of the chapters, we ask all of you to check in, to connect to your current knowledge and practice, to bring forward, to surface what it is that you know, what you've experienced, really that mental Velcro, so that you can continue to make connections. So hopefully you completed your mind map, and maybe we'll come back to that. We'll see. All right. So one of the things that I thought I wanted to do this evening with you is to just review these terms with you, because I think in order to understand what we mean by levels of understanding, we have to take a look at, you know, what are the different levels that we want our students working their way through, all right? What are the processes even and the skills that are connected back to being able to work at the surface, the text base, and then the mental model level. So here I'm going to ask you to share in the chat box, and you can choose, all right? You can choose either surface code, text base, or mental model, all right? Just a few words that come to mind when I say those words to you, and then you reflect on them. So choose either surface code, text base, mental model, and let's just put a few words, you know, put whatever it is you're talking about. So surface code, and then a few words, or text base and a few words, or mental model in a few words, your understanding comes to mind for you, right? And Kirsten and Julia, I'll just ask you to kind of monitor the chat box.
So Denise writes, surface code equals decoding syntax. Jennifer wrote text-based, supporting with evidence.
Interesting ways of thinking about this. Okay.
Aviva writes mental model, the larger representation of the text, words on the page, plus background knowledge. Melinda's surface code is the exact words. Nina put surface code literal. Karen wrote mental model, what you think. Beth put mental model experiences.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so in line with that, all right, just a few things that I put together for you. And of course, this is explained within the chapter itself. So yes, exact words, syntax used in the text, all right? And if I were reading from the one and only Ivan, I know this is one of Aviva's favorites, and I would just reading this very brief excerpt from the book. If I ask the question, what is his domain made of? Then my students would have to tap into the surface code, because they can find the answer right there, right? So what is his domain made of? Well, he talks about thick glass, rusty metal, rough cement, right? So being able to work with the vocabulary, being able to work with the sentence structure, right? The text space, though, as someone said, it goes beyond the words and the sentences that are on the page, right? It does require an integration of background knowledge. And so where do they live? Well, you know, you begin to put together that we're talking about animals, we're talking about enclosures for animals. And so what should come to mind is a zoo. And if you know the book, it's not a very nice zoo. It's one in a mall, right? And then overall understanding of the meaning of the text, right? Something that we take away with us, something that we can apply, right? What does this story teach us about kindness and empathy? What are the examples that the students kind of take away? What are the lessons that they learn about kindness and empathy? Because certainly when we talk about the Ivan himself, he has a few friends that live with him at the mall. All right, I think the other thing to say about mental model is this, that the mental model is really the big idea, the understanding of the situation at hand, right? And one of the reasons that we use multiple texts, for instance, connected to critical understandings or big ideas, is because we continue to develop that mental model. The mental model is nuanced each and every time we read something that connects back to, let's say, themes that have to do with kindness and empathy, right? Or other critical understandings or big ideas that we're wanting our students to acquire over time. And that's an important point, I think, to keep in mind. Okay. All right, here's a quick lexicon check, all right? And I want you all just thinking for a moment about what does this word bring to mind for you when you think about the word coherence, right? And this can have it's almost like there's a surface code here, and then you can go deeper with the meaning of the word coherence. It's an important word to understand, though, particularly as we talk about inference, all right? So when we think about coherence, we're talking about when ideas stick together, and we could go back and do, a little breakdown of the word. We could talk about the prefix, we could talk about the root, we could talk about the suffix, all right? It's about things coming together, cohering or sticking together because they are logical, they're organized, right? And so when the text is cohesive, the overall text, then the reader understands how the ideas and relationships presented work together, right? And this is critical. Not all authors, right, are going to write in a cohesive manner. And so here again, we begin to talk about the fact that the reader has to come with knowledge, with background knowledge, with linguistic knowledge and so on, because there are these semantic breaks, right, that occur throughout the text where we have to fill in, right, not only bridge ideas, but fill in gaps as well, right? Okay. All right. So to fully gain the intended meaning from a text, a reader must go beyond the surface level, work with the text base, and integrate related knowledge to create a coherent mental representation or mental model that is the overall understanding of the situation expressed in the text. Now, note the citation here. This is 1988. This is Walter Kinch's work, right? And he, I think, recently passed away. His theory is the construction integration theory. And he's very much about not only do we construct, all right, knowledge, but we do that through integrating at these varied levels of understanding. And why are we talking about this? What's the connection? Well, the connection is at the heart of this process is inference. It's the process by which the reader integrates within or across texts using his or her knowledge to fill in information not explicitly stated, right? So again, be thinking about, and we'll be talking about different types of inference, but this is sort of the beginnings of thinking about the fact that as we come to text, as the reader comes to text, they're integrating ideas within and between, right? And they're also doing what? They're filling in the gaps so that they understand what's represented in the text. Right? All right. So that then brings us to inference and thinking a little bit about what inference means. So again, I'm going to ask you to surface what you think inference is. And I didn't have this, I don't think, on our schedule of activities, Kirsten or Julia, but I think maybe we'll just have them put in the chat box again. Just a few words that come to mind if you were describing or defining inference. Let's see what we come up with.
Implying meaning from what is provided, conclusion based on evidence, conclusion reached using background knowledge. I teach my students that text plus brain equals infer. I like that.
Okay.
And
that's great.
an idea based on evidence. Inference is using knowledge of pragmatics, figurative language, as well as
Mhm.
background knowledge.
Mhm.
Inference is what I read plus what I know equals conclusion. Inference is using what you know to help understand what is being read. Inferences are taking what we know from the text mixed with background knowledge to draw a conclusion. Take what you read plus what you know equals logical conclusion, and using what you know and what the text says to draw a conclusion or an understanding of what is not stated.
All right. Very cool. So this is the definition. This is Kendow's definition. And I think it's a very meaningful one because it focuses on the two types of inference we're going to be talking about this evening, which in the literature are called necessary inferences. So first of all, the identification of meaningful relations between the various parts of the text. So let's stop there. All right. Right. The meaningful relations between the parts of the text. Wait a minute. Right. How do we tie that up? Well, you all know we tie it up by thinking about what are the idea units that are connected or related within and between sentences, and the device that we use are called cohesive devices. So at the sentence level. So sometimes when we talk about that particular type of necessary inference, we talk about it under the umbrella of sentence comprehension. But keep in mind, all the strands of the rope are woven together. It's really difficult sometimes to disentangle these, all right? So these are bridging inferences, all right? And then we're talking about between those parts and the reader's background knowledge. And those are the ones most often, I think, in the past, when we talked about inference, even when I learned about inference, we would talk about these gap filling inferences, right? And so more often than not, that's what comes to mind. But I think as we have conversation this evening, we need to be thinking about these two types of necessary inferences, and we're going to go there in a moment. All right. The other thing I want to make comment on is something that Julia just read in the chat about figurative language, right? You know, when we make meaning of individual words, right? If we use context or if we use morphology, independent word learning strategies, we really have to infer the meaning of the words from what? From the context, which may be directive or not, right? And or from the morphemes, which don't give you the precise interpretation of the word meaning, but rather you have to use some inference as well. All right, so I think that's important. And figurative language is yet another example of how we have to start thinking about, it's not the literal meaning, all right? We have to start thinking about what does it actually mean? What's sort of below the surface in terms of that. Okay. So I've kind of given you a little heads up on this. What types of inference are necessary to comprehension, and how do we build proficiency instructionally, all right? And again, we're doing the what, so we always do the what first, all right? And yes, we have represented in our construction house levels of understanding, and what we're focused on here, not literal, all right? We're focused on what's inferential, okay? So here's a try this, all right? And I think you probably already know the answer to this, but we'll use the chat box again. And so fill in the blank, all right, with either global coherence or local coherence. And use A, all right, is either global or local, and B is either global or local. So let's go ahead and do that. What do you think A is? What do you think B is? We really kind of led you to this.
A, local. Yep,
Yeah.
A, local, B, global, B, global. Yep, it's
Yeah.
coming in.
Yeah, yeah. So we made this pretty easy for you. And you know, I think really my first introduction to this was the work of Oak Hill and Kane. And some of you, of course, know their work. They're from Great Britain. They're researchers. I know Kate Kane's at University of Lancaster. I'm not certain where Jane Oak Hill is. And they really it was Kate Kane that introduced me, hearing her speak and reading her works, and then reading the works of her and Oak Hill, that led me to a deeper understanding of this. And I hadn't thought about it this way before. I had really thought about subtypes, you know, like like prediction, right? Or like causal inferences. Those are subtypes, right? Those are ways in which we use, for instance, gap filling inferences. Okay. All right. And Julia will be talking more about this, but this is a little bit of a heads up, all right, ahead of time. So just thinking a little bit about local coherence, all right, and this is a tip for success, and it's embedded within the chapter. But we like to just keep reminding ourselves about the fact that there are some things we should always be asking ourselves as we plan for instruction. So we'll give you just a moment to read. All right. So we'll move on. And as I said in a little bit here, Julia will be directly addressing these. All right. Just a quick reminder, when I went back and looked at the chapter, I don't know that we certainly spoke to cohesive devices, but not in detail. And I just wanted to kind of bring this forward and remind you again about the fact that there are syntactic and semantic elements, all right? So they have to do with the way in which we structure order up by sentences. They have to do with meaning, carrying meaning, and they're necessary for bridging and integrating. So very often they're called bridging inferences. And they divide, cohesive devices divide into these two subcategories. We have cohesive ties, and of course, I think many of you can come up with examples for these. Pronouns. So, for instance, the one and only Ivan, he, all right. Synonyms, substitutions, in which we might use, such as instead of Ivan, we might say the great ape. Who's the great ape? Oh, it's Ivan. And then the repetition, Ivan, and then Ivan again, and then Ivan again. And then ellipsis, in which we have a sentence in which we haven't quite finished the sentence, but one has to use the information provided beforehand in order to complete the thought of the sentence. And then connectives, all right? And this is a different type of cohesive device. And again, we begin to think about writing. We should be thinking about writing throughout. Thanks to Aviva that she brought up. Yeah, that is one of my favorite things, to make the connection between comprehension and composition. But yeah, certainly direct connections here in terms of the meaning of conjunctions. Sometimes adverbs also will serve as connectives. And we'll see this very often in subordinating clauses. Sometimes we talk about them as subordinating conjunctions. So these are what? These are cohesive devices, and what they do is they signal relationships. They tie up ideas within and between sentences. So this is local coherence, right? All right, and then coming back, we have global coherence, right? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. All right, here's some tips for global coherence that I'm just going to give you because you already know what the definition description is. I don't need to go back to that. Just take a moment and read through here. Tips for success again. So some of these ideas are repeating, but some of them are somewhat different. And here, of course, we have the importance of using background knowledge, right? And then pulling text examples, right? So now I want you to be thinking a little bit about readers use global inferences too. I want you to think about your experience, or your experience if you're a specialist. I recognize many of you are reading specialists, speech language, some of you classroom teachers, interventionists, all these different roles that you fulfill. But what have you seen, or what have you done? How have you used inference, all right? How have you taught your students to use inference? And I heard someone say to draw conclusions, and that is a subtype of inference. So I want you to know that, all right? Because we can use inferences, global inferences, for lots and lots of different reasons. All right, so again, go to the chat box.
People are thinking.
They're thinking, yeah.
Okay. To connect to their experiences, make connections between ideas, text, and knowledge. In order to help my students infer, we first identify what we know, gather information, and conclude.
Okay, all right.
Find meaning for clarity.
All right. Okay, let me share a few here, and I think you'll make connections to these as well. To understand the causal events. So we make causal prediction or causal inferences. I'm sure many of you ask your students to predict, maybe predict what it's going to be about, maybe predict future actions. These are just some examples. So predictive type inferences. Sometimes to identify setting. And in a moment, I'll share the 3 examples that we actually have in the chapter, all right? To identify characters' motives and beliefs, right? Why did they do that, all right? To understand characters' relationships. There's the conclusions. To understand authors' views or bias. So these are just a few ways in which we make inference. And I think it's important that as we kind of begin to think this through, we're thinking about, okay, overall picture, we're going to fill in the gaps here, all right? But why are we filling in the gaps, all right? What's the focus that we're going to use in order to help our students better understand different aspects of the text itself, all right? So here's a drawing conclusions. And even little guys, Julia and I talk about this a lot, the use of picture books, and even little guys can make inference. Now, they may not be able to, for a character, tell you their motives or beliefs. So that's a little bit more advanced, all right? But they can tell you maybe kind of on a literal level, you know, what's going on with the character. So who do you think brought the frog to dinner and why? And so when you see the picture on the cover of Frog Goes to Dinner, you can quickly come to the conclusion that it's a little guy. And what are we bringing to mind? What background knowledge? Well, the look that we get when we've done something and we're caught, right? Identifying setting, and we already talked about this one. Where is the gorilla and how do you know, right? So very often the setting, you know, may in narrative text, we might have lots of description of it before we actually are told what the exact setting is, even understanding why that setting has been used, right? And then here's one for understanding cause. People started coming to North America in the 1600s. They were called colonists. They were from all over Europe, but most came from England. British had the greatest influence in America because of this. America became part of England. Why did people leave their homes to come to North America? And this comes directly from the founding of American democracy, which is a little bit more advanced than Frog Goes to Dinner or even the One and Only Ivan. So, and of course, it's informational text. So we use our global inference for varied reasons. Okay, so we've done the what, and we threw in a little bit of the how there with our tips. And here's our why. Okay, this is the work of Amy Elliman. And if you want to read some really very thorough and very good research on inference, particularly as students move through the grades up into middle school, for instance, take a look at Amy Elliman's work. She's at Middle Tennessee State University, right? She's done lots of meta-analyses. So researchers in linguistics, cognitive psychology, and education consider inference a central component in language comprehension and essential to reading comprehension. And we only have to look at 2 of these models. We could look at others as well, but we can see that, you know, Hoover and Tummer have included, all right, this in their model, all right? And so has our friend Hollis Scarborough. So yes, this is a critical component of language comprehension. And then if we just go back to the work of Kane and Oakhill, in which they talked about the levels of language processes that are necessary as we work our way through the text. And some of you, you know, probably recall these words. You know, certainly we want our students reading the text, being able to read the words, if not reading by ear. They need to access the meaning of the words that they're reading. They have to work out the syntactic structure, but then, all right, they make the point. They have to integrate, right, this information, the ideas between the different sentences, and here comes the local coherence, and then they have to do the background knowledge, you know, to understand what's only implicitly mentioned. So we see throughout the literature the importance of background knowledge then contributing to this ability to go below the surface of the text inference. All right. So I'm about to hand this off to my colleague and good friend, the blueprint for comprehension instruction. Okay, Julia.
Thanks, Nancy. So we're going to kind of go into the how. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll go through the lesson plans, examples, and then talk through some various activities. But as we're thinking about the design of instruction, we always start with these questions. So thinking about and keeping present in my mind as I'm planning, well, how will I teach students to construct meaning at the different levels of understanding? And I want to include the surface, the text-based, and the mental model, right? I want to move them along those different levels of understanding. How are you going to teach students to integrate ideas and background knowledge to the text? And then how will you support your students' deep comprehension of text? So Nancy just mentioned Amy Elliman, and this comes from that study where they were looking at a multi-strategy inference intervention, and it was really designed for students in like middle grade struggling readers. But what kind of was able to be gleaned from this were these recommendations and considerations that the inference attuned teacher should take into mind as they are planning. The first is that students practice answering or generating inferential questions during or after reading. We've talked a lot about questioning and how powerful that is as a strategy. And that, it's no surprise that it pops up as number one there. We also want to teach students how to use clues in the text to construct a coherent representation. We're going to talk a little bit about what this looks like for local coherence and global coherence, right? And how that kind of translates with those types of inferences. We want to explicitly teach students to use their background knowledge to fill in the gaps in the text, starting with this idea of providing teacher modeling. I say this many times, but you are the most skilled reader in the room. So making your thinking, making your process transparent is really critical for kids. And then graphic organizers. They're very, very helpful to help with the text structure, to make it clear and to also activate background knowledge. And then thinking about the subcategories and practicing them. And then students are learning to connect text ideas with prior knowledge through their own self-explanation. So moving them into that metacognitive interaction where they're really like thinking about the text, they're connecting it to their knowledge, and then they're kind of, oh, this makes sense because. So how do we get them to that point? All right, so we're going to be kind of going through different activities. And again, we'll talk about questioning, very, very, very powerful. The use of visual and textual cues, graphic organizers, and think alouds. And oftentimes you'll be looking at a combination of approaches because, using these strategies in combination is even more powerful. But I think it's really important to just talk about, before we jump in, about the teacher action. So as the teacher, it's my responsibility. I want to identify the text. And once I have my text sets, I'm going to prepare and plan around that text. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like, but really thinking mindfully about the passages and what I'm going to be framing as a question or a prompt. Again, I want to model the identification of clues and the integration of background knowledge so that I can make that process really transparent for my students. And then also I want to show them how I would answer those questions and prompts. All right, so we're going to hop into the model lesson plans. We're going to look at two, one that touches on local inferencing, and it does make that writing connection, which we've been talking about. And then the second, which is global inferencing. So as we go through them, just kind of give them a thought and how that they might align to your own practices. All right, so this is actually one of my favorite lessons, I think, in the activity book. So this first lesson is all about the writing connection and using editing and revising to improve local coherence. And I think what's really powerful about this is that you can capitalize on that reading writing connection, as this activity really serves to think about, okay, well, how do we create varied word choice in our writing? Why do authors do that? How do we eliminate repetition? How do we take maybe simple, short syntactical structures and using our knowledge of connectives, turn them, combine them and make much more robust and interesting text for our readers to engage with? So in this lesson plan, which is on pages 163 and 166, the teacher starts by modeling the use of varied cohesive ties and then sentence combining, and really with this emphasis on avoiding redundancy and creating an overall cohesive piece of writing. And I think so for this lesson, we're focusing on the text that students are reading and learning about, and it connects to that Who Am I unit and the house on Mango Street. So in this way, students are developing the skills within the context of the text that they're reading and they're studying in school. So we're going to do a quick little activity. So I want you to take a moment and read this passage. And in the chat, you can just put it in the chat when you're done. But what issues do you notice in the text, right? And what revisions might you suggest for this student? So we'll give you a minute to do that.
I'm not seeing anything just yet, Julia, but I'm watching and I think you're
no worries.
Wow. Yeah. There we go. The use of Amy, use pronouns. All right. Use of pronouns to replace overused nouns. Pronouns. All right. Jennifer says sequencing. Yeah. Right. Pronouns.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah. Combo of sentence. Yep. I'm seeing some of them pop up now. Yeah. No, you guys are definitely on to something. Yeah.
Right.
So I think what's interesting about this, I see sentence variety, sentence fluency, structure, and the timeline. Yeah, there's like a lot of really good things to dig into and unpack here. I think with the pronoun, right, that I'm sure all of us have read those texts where the student uses the same words over, over and over and over again. I was just reading an essay today about Pearl Harbor, where Pearl Harbor was named about 1 million times. Anyhow, but this idea that we can edit and revise our work to give it more variety, it improves the flow. We can edit and revise our work to vary our sentence structures, vary our sentence lengths and complexity. And again, these are all tools that authors use to make their writing more interesting and effective for the reader. All right. So the next lesson is tied to the Proudest Blue, which is such a beautiful read aloud. If you haven't had a chance to read it, highly recommend. And the first grade unit, which is all about me. And so this unit really, or this lesson really focuses on using graphic organizers to support global coherence inference making. And so here we're really teaching students, and again, we can think about our younger guys, right? Well, what does the character do? What are their actions, right? What do they say? And what's their thoughts? And we can begin to make an inference about what that character's like. And this connects to, in this unit overall, a lot of work around adjectives, and students are learning all about themselves and being able to describe themselves. So, with teacher modeling and going through the text and starting out by thinking about, well, what does the character do? Well, she's excited by her new backpack and light up shoes, and she loves to twirl. Well, Phaedra, she's a joyful character, right? We have a scene where she's imagining that she and her sisters are princesses, draws them having a picnic, and we know that she's creative. And there's a really great scene in the book at the recess yard, and she goes over to the big kid's side to give her sister a hug. Well, what can we infer about her? She's protective. She loves her big sister. So again, using supports like that, and starting with our younger learners to be able to then make inferences. So this is the book I am reading right now with my juniors, one of my favorites, The Great Gatsby. I feel like every time I read it, I uncover something new. So we're going to do another try this. Read this passage, and I want you to put two things in the chat. I want you to think about what are Daisy's words, actions, or thoughts, right? And based on these, what character traits can you infer? How would you describe Daisy?
I'm still waiting. I know people are thinking and
Yeah.
yeah.
Any thoughts?
I don't see anything yet.
Okay.
There you go. Not
All
drinking.
right. Yeah. So we're starting to get I seeing some things come in, right? Worldly, traveling around, not drinking amongst hard drinking people. She's careful, she's cautious, right? I love that adjective savvy, cares about how others perceive her. She's cautious, she's discreet. You could argue that she's clever or that she's manipulative, right? Like, yeah, 100%, right? Insightful. She's careful, premeditated. She's experienced and confident. Yeah, all of these based on this text, and we can see her actions and how that supports that. So 100%. She's a fascinating character. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about local coherence inference activities. We'll go through these, and then we'll shift over to global coherence. So questioning, again, questioning is incredibly powerful. Using it in combination with other strategies, incredibly effective. But so I think really being mindful though. So here are some aligned questions, and they're connected to the short stories Fish Cheeks, or the short story Fish Cheeks, which is in the Who Am I unit. But before even getting to, having these aligned questions and posing them to students, being really mindful that all of these, the cohesive ties and the connectives, there's a lot of direct instruction that goes around that first. So students are explicitly taught, okay, what is a pronoun referent? What are synonyms and substitutions? How does that function in the text? Same with connectives, going through the different types. So there's a lot of explicit instruction that leads up to that. I wouldn't just sort of plop them down and give them questions. But once that instruction is in place and students know what these terms are, really thinking about how can we develop questions that tap into this knowledge. I think this idea that, especially in Fish Cheeks, the first question in the sentence, which pronoun refers to Tan's relatives? To the chopsticks? What do you notice about the pronoun? Why does this usage make the sentence trickier to comprehend, right? We have that sentence, my relatives licked the ends of their chopsticks and reached across the table, dipping them into a dozen or so plates of food, right? We have that pronoun use, which can be tricky depending on your reader and what they know and how they're able to unpack that sentence. If we think about that last piece of text or that last section with repetitions, what would Robert think of our shabby Chinese Christmas? What would he think of our noisy Chinese relatives who lacked proper American manners? What terrible disappointment would he feel upon seeing not a roast turkey and sweet potatoes, but Chinese food? I think this section like that would be a really great opportunity to talk about repetition and why the author chose to repeat that word throughout that passage. Why is that really important to think about? So we can get at different levels of understanding. The same goes for our use of connectives in the text. We would always begin with that direct instruction around these different connectives and, thinking about making sure my students had that knowledge base, but then building in questions, right? I really like, it's really powerful when I think students have that knowledge base and they're able to see that. Oftentimes, kids will come and they'll have good sentence eyes and ears, and they've kind of been able to intuitively do it. But the power of teaching them, okay, these contrasting connectives, right? Even though they signal this contrast in the sentence, that's such a powerful tool, and it has such a great then translation to their writing. So highlighting and coding again. So always thinking and being mindful that we would begin with direct instruction of these things. But one way to draw students' attention to this through visual cues and using that to help them identify them, you can use highlighting and coding. So for this assignment, I would prepare my text, I would find my passage, and I would select the topics or concepts that I wanted my students to work on. This is The Jacket by Gary Soto, again, connected to that unit. So students are working with text that they're reading about and learning about in school. And so I'd select that text and give them a series of tasks, right? So the first one is underline the pronouns that refer to Gary's mother. The second would be connect the arrows to the synonyms or substitutions to the words that refer to the jacket. I love how at one point he calls the jacket a stranger. He does not like that jacket. And then putting a box around the connectives that signal the reader to the passage of time. And so all of these things would be pre-taught. And then we would ask students to code them. Now that could be done in, they could do it right in the book. They could do it on, a piece of paper. I really like what I think is really cool with this application, which is Kami. It's an online annotation and markup tool. You could share this with multiple students. And so all the ones, you're going to do the pronouns, all the twos. And so they're in groups of 3 and they each have a specific task. So this could be something that's collaborative and kind of a different approach than just, doing it with individually in their own book on their own.
I love that, Julia. I love the idea of the direct explicit teaching with examples from the text and then the practice and processing. And as you were talking, I was even thinking this is a way of assessing the students, have understood what it is that they need to know in terms of cohesive devices.
Yeah. I also think that we can use picture and visual supports for developing precise use of connectives. I believe it's Oakhill and colleagues, again, who talks about, we can use these picture supports for supporting our youngest learners. So we can start to think about, for example, causality, which is sort of where my mind is these days because I'm thinking about history text a lot. But we can develop causality using a picture support like this one. So students are reading the text chrysanthemum, right? And so we want to get at that causality. And so why does chrysanthemum drag her feet in the dirt on the way to school? And so again, I think when we think about these activities too, providing students with the opportunity to respond orally, right? Oral response. This is a great way. Why does it happen? You know, why does she do this? Well, she drags her feet because the other children tease her about her name. And so she's taken her sweet time getting to school that day. But we can do this for our older learners too. So I love some like primary source authentic images. So these are actually images of women in Iran before the revolution. So using these as a support for students reading Persepolis. And so the question here is, why were Iranian women motivated to participate in protests and activism during the revolution? Just like Marjane's mother was, right? And what were the primary like grievances and aspiration? Like, what did they hope to get, right? Well, they were motivated to participate because their rights were significantly restricted. We can see in those pictures what life was like before. It was really different. Women were in college, they were doctors, you know, in terms of they were able to dress how they wanted. So it was very different. So they wanted equality. They wanted that regarding education. They wanted employment. They wanted it in terms of their ability to participate politically in their society.
Yeah, you can see the overlap with the development of background knowledge here as well. I love it. Okay.
Yeah.
Integration. Yeah. All right.
So we're going to shift and we're going to talk a little bit about global coherence inferencing. And we'll start with questioning. So this is Frederick, which is one of my favorite books of all time. If you haven't read it, please do yourself a favor and do it because it's such a great book. But again, we can use questioning with our younger learners to really begin to help them infer and draw out things about character, right? We know kids can get there. Our younger learners can get there. So this is, I think, an activity that taps into that. So after reading Frederick, right, we think about the things that he thinks, he does, the words he says, his description. We know through his thoughts and his feelings, he's always thinking about ways to brighten the dark days of winter. He's part of this little colony of mice, and they know winter's coming, and he's kind of got that in his head. His actions, he is he's very arty. He loves to gather sun rays and colors. Meanwhile, his friends are gathering corn and nuts and wheat. He's participating in his community in a little bit of a different way. And he writes poetry. And you might describe him as dreamy. He's creative. He's a poet. And his words, I do work. I gather sun rays for the cold, dark winter days. I gather colors for winter is gray. I gather words so that we, we'll run out of things to say. So what do we know about his personality? Well, he's a dreamer. He's creative. He's all of these artistic, right? We think about all the things that he does, his thoughts, his feelings, his actions, his words. We can put that together and describe him. We can do this with our older guys too. So I teach in an upper school setting. This was one of my colleagues' political cartoons. And, these days teaching in an upper school, I'm sure for those of you who do, DBQs are a huge deal. So these document-based questions where kids are asked to look at multiple primary sources and analyze, and then, write up and kind of talk about the evidence they're presented with. So this was a French cartoon that they were using in connection with a unit on imperialism. And so Jeremy developed these really great series of questions that he used when analyzing political cartoons. So this idea of what was happening when the cartoon was made, thinking about the time period, the context, thinking about whether this was an accurate representation. Were there other primary sources that connected? So Nancy and I have been talking a lot about this, but in history, with history texts, we have multiple sources, right? Because we have to look at that to corroborate different accounts. Who's the audience? And then getting into kind of the thinking about techniques like word choice, caricature, exaggeration, all of that stuff, and how that communicates message. And then thinking about the cartoonist, what was their stance on this issue? So, you know, using these cues, these questions, really getting the kids to think about, well, what I'm seeing is this stereotyped image of this Chinese official, and he is protesting, he's got his hands up. And along the bottom, we see all of these imperialist nations. We see Britain, we see Germany, we see France, we see Russia, we see Japan. They're all carving up China, right? And so this was taking place at a time when the unequal treaties were imposed upon China. So the imperialist nations put these treaties in place, and the Chinese people, they had to give up land, they had to pay reparations. Opium was legalized, which was very devastating for the country, and all of this happened under threat of military action. So able to kind of think about, all right, this is what I'm seeing. And now I think the cartoonists did this, they created this image very purposefully to communicate this time in history.
Yeah. What I like about this is the fact that it's a combo platter, right? It's not just about using the picture or the visual. It's about, you know, getting your students to think about the questions that then lead them to, I think. I'm able to come to a conclusion here. The other thing, as you were doing this, and I think it's just so important for us to be making the connections back to text structure knowledge, for instance, or other types of knowledge. You know, one of the things we have to be thinking about is not everything is in print, right? So we need to be thinking about text structures from a multimodal point of view more and more for our students. So yeah,
yeah, and I know someone in the chat had said, "What's a DBQ?" Very kind of, it's all the rage in upper school and high school history. But what students get, and so for like the AP exams, and for just exams and tests in general, they get multiple documents. It could be like legal text from the time period. It could be political cartoons. It could be a range of primary sources, and they're asked to analyze and then, you know, come to a conclusion or argue a point of view based upon those images. It's a really hard task. And, you know, I think a lot of the boys that I work with, it's not an easy thing to do. So I think I always think about that. It's like some of the tasks that we ask them to do, you know, yes, they are in high school. Yes, they are older, but this is I think it's very demanding.
Yeah. It's a part of moving from really content area instruction. And this is, Julia and I have been working on this, and we'll be talking about this for the secondary conference for Patton. But moving from really the blueprint for a content area, you know, understanding or comprehension, beginning in the early grades right up through, and using that as a foundation then to move to, all right, going deeper with some of the characteristics that we find, some of the different kinds of questions we need to ask, the different types of strategies we have to use for disciplinary texts. And I know that certainly Julia's working with boys, but it's pretty typical in high school setting, particularly when students are in advanced or honor classes, for them to have to look at multiple documents and to use those documents to respond to questions.
Yeah, my niece actually just took the APs, and she called me up after to debrief about all of the, you know, the document-based questions that she had to analyze. So yeah, I think it's something that students are definitely faced with, and it's challenging.
Yeah, and really, regardless of the age that you're working with, the grade you're working with, we're building toward that for our students, you know, so
Yeah.
we have to keep thinking about how they acquire these skills and competencies at basic as well as more advanced levels.
Yeah.
Okay.
So graphic organizers, this is a graphic organizer that, you know, thinking about kind of that upper elementary grade levels, and it's connected to the text. Oh my gosh, now I'm like Benjamin Banneker, who.
Benjamin Banneker, yeah, about
Thank you. But
Pinkney, yeah.
yeah, it's a beautiful book. Really well, beautifully written and then gorgeously illustrated. But it talks a lot about Benjamin Banneker and sort of his quest for equality. And so the question posed, right, that we learn about in the book is that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And so why do you think he did it? And so the text tells us, right, it says, well, Jefferson, we know he signed the Declaration of Independence. Most Black men and women during Banneker's time, right, in the late 1700s, were enslaved. And we also knew that Banneker was an abolitionist, and he was also a freeman. So I know, right? He was a freeman. He was the son of a slave. He had accomplished so many things. He wrote an almanac. He predicted the solar eclipse. He was amazing scientist. But he also saw the experiences of those around him, and they did not have those same opportunities. And Jefferson, he had written the Declaration of Independence, written those words, all men are created equal. So I can infer, right? Banneker knew that slavery was wrong. He was angry about the injustice, and he felt he's had to do something about it. So he contacted Jefferson because he knew Jefferson was powerful and fought for independence, and he might listen. He actually called Jefferson out and called him a hypocrite, which is like huge, right? Like so, and Jefferson was in this position to do something, and Benjamin knew that. So really quite a revolutionary Banneker. And if you haven't seen the book, it's amazing. But I think that what's great about a graphic organizer like this, we can scaffold it, right? We can give them the question, and then we could give them some of the evidence from the text and start them off that way. And so then they have to think about what we already knew, what we talked about, what we build that knowledge base. And so what I think, I'm going to connect that to my own knowledge base. And that's a nice way to scaffold it for kids and kind of get them to get there, to help to support them to get there.
Yeah. And actually, this is based off of a research study that Karsten Elbro did. And of course, he's a co-author on the book that Oak Hill and Kane wrote about, Understanding About Comprehension. And he designed it for those kids who have knowledge, but can't always bring the knowledge forward, all right? Can't always surface it. So Julia's description here in terms of scaffolding, is right on. Okay.
And then here's another graphic organizer connecting into like inferring with setting, right? So this is from Persepolis and, thinking about when the revolution took place, 1979, and then in 80, things changed dramatically. The girls had to wear veils in school. They weren't explained. It was just kind of mandated. The boys and girls were separated. So lots of changes happening, right? And so I can infer that this setting is becoming more restrictive for women after 1979 based upon these changes that Marjane Satrapi is talking about from her childhood. And I know this because the book, it talks about how schools in Tehran, they were separated, the boys and the girls. Women and girls were made to wear veils, always covering. We also know that in 1979, the Shah was overthrown. So, and we have a new leader coming into power, bringing back very kind of seeing like the Western world as like banning that and seeing that as the enemy. And women were denied equal rights in the process. So again, another type of graphic organizer that could be used to support students in making those inferences and getting them there.
All right, I think, Julia, maybe we'll skip this and come back to it and go to the breakout room.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. So Kirsten, here's our breakout room with our varied topics. And how many breakout rooms will we have this time around, Kirsten? We have 31 people now. So are we adding one or two breakout rooms?
We are. I'm going to recreate them. You want about 5 to 6 people in a group?
Yeah, so maybe 6 breakout rooms with 5 people in each group. That would work.
That's totally fine. Yep.
And again, we won't be having breakout room number 7, but we will be having 1 through 6. So remember your number and remember what it is you're going to talk about. So if you're in 1, you'll be talking about editing to improve local coherence. These are all things that Julia just described and that are in the chapter.
And you're thinking,
go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. 7 minutes again?
I think we'll go with about 8 minutes on this,
Okay.
this time because it'll take a little bit longer to discuss. Yeah. Okay. So breakout room number 1, editing to improve local coherence. Breakout room number 2, questioning and cohesive ties and connectives. 3, highlighting and coding. 4, picture visual supports for connectives. 5, questioning and global coherence. 6, picture visual supports for global coherence. And we are not doing 7, but if someone wants to take it on, by all means, you can include it in your conversation.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll go for 8 minutes. And when you come back, all right, we're going to do a share out. So make certain you have somebody who's willing to come forward and speak. And we appreciate it each time when someone is willing to do that. All right.
Okay, they're open.
Wow, we're getting to see lots of folks again. All right. Don't think we're all back just yet. I think about half of us are back. Oh, some people are still talking. This is a good thing. All right. Yep, here they come. All right, I think we're all back. Wonderful. Okay, anxious to hear what you all have to share. Let's see what we can do in the time that's remaining. Room number 5, I didn't come to you before, but I'm coming to you now. So hopefully you remember who you are. And I think you talked about questioning and global coherence inferences, but you may have talked about some other things as well. So let's see who wants to speak to the conversation in room number 5. Let's see what pearls of wisdom we can get from you. Who's in 5?
I can speak for the group. I accidentally hit the leave room button every time when it pops. And,
so what was that information that you were going to share with us, Beth?
No, I'll just share it. But some of us work with students with that are on the autism spectrum, and I mean, I'm not a labels person, but we were saying that the label doesn't even really matter. There's commonalities with all kids with productive struggle in coming up with questions. So the questioning piece, and even formulating a question, just having that in your language repertoire can be difficult. And even as an adult, it can be difficult because we're used to talking at each other and not always being super inquisitive. And then, the whole thing of how some people like to say schools kill creativity, that whole thing, we chop off their question repertoire because we're teaching. But I think what I was going to share, I hope it's okay, but so out of the field of autism, I mean, I'm a behavior analyst as well, and there's someone named Mark Sundberg and the verbal behavior map, but this assessment's not included in the verbal behavior map to my knowledge. But he did this very interesting study of typically developing kids and kids with autism, and he looked at the questions and he compared them in videotapes, coding them. I'm going to get really quick here, but the typically developing kids, if you ask, he had levels, and so the first levels of fill in, and then it goes up to what's inside a balloon, and all those different, there's 8 levels. And what he found was, if you typically get this level 3 at 24 months, well, if you ask a 24-month-old the level 5, the kids made the same errors. So if you ask 2 levels up, you're going to make these wonky errors. And yet, like, if we look at a kid with autism, it's like, oh, well, they just talk weird. No, you're asking them a question that's above the level that they're at. It doesn't matter if you're typically developing or not. So I just found that fascinating, but I also like to know, as a teacher, I like to ask questions that are below their level so that they can engage with the text and not have that cognitive load take over with the understanding the language. But then the same thing, wouldn't that apply to them formulating questions in their text?
Yeah. Really
So
fascinating. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's all.
No,
let me be long-winded.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Fascinating. I think even before you began to describe the levels, I started to write down teachers need to teach kids how to frame questions, and what do those levels of questions look like. So if you have a research reference or citation you can share, I'm sure some people here, including myself and Julia, would be interested. It's almost like having sentence frames for kids,
Yeah.
but they're question frames. So
I was gonna, Nancy, I was gonna say, I'm gonna put a link in the chat. It's for the QFT, which is question formulation technique. It's out of Harvard. And I did their training. It's like really, really simple, but it's all about getting kids. It's like a structured protocol for getting kids to develop their own questioning. What we noticed with some of our upper schoolers was we do a research project with them. And so they have to generate their own research questions, and they really struggled. They struggled to create questions that like were more, sophisticated. And again, this is like a really simple protocol. They have a lot of free resources on their website. But I think, this idea of asking questions, not only is it like critical thinking and so important, but it's like their ability then to participate in like the civic community at large. So I think sometimes that was something like we as teachers, we ask questions, but then how do we get them to ask their own questions? And I think check out the resources and check out the website. The training was like super, it was like very, like if you want to do the training, it's like very affordable. It's good. And they have a lot of free resources as well.
Okay, cool. All right. Wow, that was a good discussion. Let's go to room number 6. Picture visual supports for developing global coherence inferences. So who was in 6?
I was in 6.
Okay.
We talked a little bit, one of us was an ESL instructor, talked about looking at different pictures in that group. And we talked about looking at pictures. I taught in a resource room for 7th grade reading, and I've taught various levels of readers in that room. And I've used pictures to share. I've done them for different strategies. I've used pictures to have them write. And with my students that were autistic, it was sometimes hard for them to infer. So I would offer them the ability to literally write what they saw. I gave the example of I had a picture of one of my horses peeking around a pole, and some of my students wrote from the perspective of the horse, what he was doing, what he was thinking. Some of them wrote literally what they saw. They described the horse, where he was. And I had other students write a story about a farm and how it kind of tied into this support for the inferencing. I mean, they had to inference to write their stories, but then we went back and talked about why we thought those things. Like, where did those ideas come from? What cues did they use in the photograph to give them these ideas? What was the horse doing? What did he look like? And why then did you infer that that was what he was thinking? So they always had a really good time when they would write the stories based off something that I posted. So I love the idea of pictures. I also use movies a lot. So we can talk about, I'm a Little House on the Prairie fan, and it's real safe for 7th graders. So we would watch little pieces of the episode and we would connect it to the exposition of a story. Why was it so important for us to know Charles Ingalls was a hard worker? Because they showed us over and over and over again. Well, this was the pilot episode, so it was important to know that in the beginning. So something that I believe that those visual supports really do assist in building reading skills.
Yeah, yeah, you're talking about the building of background knowledge as well as, you know, getting them then to express their understanding through writing. So a wonderful connection to writing, very creative. Thanks. That was wonderful. Okay.
And Aviva, I was just going to say, I remember, I think there was one of the co-teachers on the 5th grade team who used to use Pixar shorts a lot for doing like questioning and inference. Like that's another, and they're great because they're short in length and, you know, you can do a lot with them. They were a lot of fun.
We watched part of a movie in one of the English classes I was in, Up, and I had never seen it. And the kids were telling me about how funny it was. So I went home and I watched it and I cried the entire movie. Well, when I went back, they asked me what I thought. And I said, I think I watched the wrong movie. And we shared these scenes. And then we talked about our background knowledge, my experience of great loss, which made me sad because I connected with the man. And it was actually really, I think, enlightening for them to see the difference that we all bring. So,
yeah. All right. Very cool. All right. Let me go to room number 3. All right. Which was highlighting and coding cohesive ties and connectives.
Hi, I was in room 3. We talked about how the coding is like when you need to show the kids like that you're looking for something specific. We looked at the example of Esperanza Rising in the book to talk about like the repetition, how can you fix that? And then Lisa talked about how with her students, sometimes she has to break it down even more before that to like find like what are the nouns in the sentence to make sure every sentence has a noun, and then using different colors, like nouns are yellow, and then like later they have to maybe verbs are a different color. But just how you have to be explicit to teach kids both of those things.
Yeah.
So that you have to model it and like be consistent, and maybe in small groups if you can't do it with your whole class of 30 to really make sure they're understanding it so then they can apply it to their comprehension and their own writing.
Yeah. You know, Denise, that's great because here's the connection back to sentence comprehension and the fact that we need to be teaching our kids the function of the parts of speech, right? So we talked about this when we talked about sentence comprehension. Again, this integration, you know, it's really difficult sometimes to disentangle these things because they're so interconnected. And so, you know, students understanding that, you know, a noun answers a question, you know, who or what. And then the pronoun stands in for it. All right. And then the examples right from text and the color coding. You're making me think about it's a NIHOUSE program that Suzanne Carricker developed. Julia, remember the name of it?
Framing Your Thoughts? Is that what you're thinking?
No, that's Project Read. It's on the tip of my tongue, but anyway, it's all about color coding the parts of speech and thinking about their function. And it's a very nice, very basic program that she developed quite a long time ago. But anyway, all right. I'm sure the rest of you all had wonderful conversations as well. But I think what we're going to do is wrap up at this point in time.
Multisensory grammar.
That's it. Woo! Yay!
Google.
So, yeah. So thanks for taking the time to do the sharing. Let me go back to share the screen. All right, and here we go. And one of the things that I think we did want to go back to, and so many of you are talking about, you know, differentiating and thinking through, you know, how one goes about doing that for students who, for varied reasons, have varied challenges. So this is the tips for success that's included in the chapter, and we're just going to give you a moment to read it to yourself. All right, so you can see that the research continues to support many of these strategies or approaches that Elliman had identified for all students. but I do recognize that, you know, as you're talking about this, you're bringing forward some very specific examples. And, you know, I will tell you that Julia and I have been working on connections to the blueprint, including connections to writing and now connections to disciplinary reading. And I do have, we haven't gotten back to this, but we did begin to work on something for students, for EL students, for multilingual students. And I think we're going to have to come back to that as well. So stay tuned, Ari. Stay tuned. Our work, as you all know this, it's never done. It's never done, but it's such good work. Okay. We were going to ask you to do this. It's something that comes up at the end of the chapter. We'll just ask you to keep thinking about these strategies that, you know, represent the research and thinking about specific examples that you're using. And I think you probably were doing some of that sharing as you just had conversation with one another, right? All right, I want you to not forget about the listening and viewing link. And so the 20th anniversary of Scarborough's Reading Rope, another patent production, what can I say? Kate Kane, whose name I reference all of the time. You can tell I'm a fangirl for Kate Kane. And you may want to take a look at her session that has everything to do with verbal reasoning with inference. She's always informative. All right. Next session, we'll be implementing the blueprint expression of understanding, but we will be asking you, and we'll send, when we send out the structured guide, we'll send you again the curriculum review tool, and we'll be asking you to take a look at it and just annotate and comment on what we've included. Provide us with any upgrades, revisions, and then send it to us individually. We're most appreciative of that. You know, we really designed that with all of you and other educators in mind, because we know that everyone's using different program curricula, sometimes one that you've developed yourself, other times whatever the district is using. And we always want to be certain that whatever we're conveying to you is useful, that you can make the connection to what it is that you're working with, all right? So much gratitude once again for being with us and for being patient with all the technical issues we've had. And I think Kirsten has a few things that she needs to share, and we will see you.